G'day, my name's Dev. I'm here on Larrakia country in Darwin at the top end of Australia's Northern Territory. In this episode I'll discuss the extraordinary history of Northern Australia. It was formed soon after the world itself and is home to the oldest continuous living culture on Earth. It was arguably the most remote part of the British Empire, so this limited the effectiveness of European settlement, and so colonisation was strangely never really completed here. Consequently, Northern Australia has a checkered history of development and is technically poorer than the South. But this has allowed traditional Aboriginal culture to survive up here and large tracts of its landscapes and coastline to remain pristine. In the words of the accomplished North Australian historian Alan Powell, it is still far country. For context, Northern Australia is the enormous top half of the Australian continent. It comprises about 45% of our total landmass, but only 5% of our population lives here. They're mostly in the small casual cities of Townsville, Cairns, Darwin, Alice Springs and Broome. These centres administer the famous outback regions of Northern Australia, the Kimberley, the Top End, Centralia, the Gulf Country and North Queensland. Spread out over this vast country is a disparate network of outback towns, enormous cattle stations, remote Aboriginal communities, top secret military bases and large-scale mining operations. Environmentally, Northern Australia is a brilliant array of tropical coastlines, mangroves, long winding river systems, eucalyptus forests and savanna bushlands, escarpment country, grassy tablelands and Centralian deserts. During its 100 million year history, it has been hit by meteorites, covered by steaming jungles and drowned beneath ancient seas. This capped the land with the hardened sediments of that sea's floor, but allowed the awesome power of Earth's molten core to thrust enormous deposits of minerals up near the surface. For tens of thousands of years, these minerals lay unknown and unwanted by the first Australians. However, today they are extracted on a massive scale as part of our multi-billion-dollar mining industry. Though rich in minerals, Northern Australia's extreme age makes its soils very poor. This, mixed with its monsoonal climate, being very wet for half the year and then very dry for the rest, means that large-scale conventional agricultural projects have failed here. At the end of every year, the Great Monsoon moves across Southeast Asia and brings magnificent lightning storms, destructive cyclones and heavy rains across Northern Australia. This water drains underground and spreads out beneath Central Australia. Where it touches the surface, it brings life to the desert. Far more important than minerals, the first Australians used this water to survive in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Western scientific thinking is that Aboriginal people arrived in Northern Australia about 60,000 years ago via a transcontinental land bridge that linked it to eastern Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. But there are also very strong Aboriginal ideologies that assert that people emerged from the dream time as the world was created, which in some accounts was not too long ago. The eventual rising of sea levels separated but did not completely disconnect Northern Australia from Southeast Asia. Dingoes are indicative of this connection. They were brought here by Indonesian seafarers about 4,000 years ago. They became an important part of Aboriginal lifestyles for thousands of years. However, they are not present in Aboriginal creation stories. This is an important example of the timelessness of Aboriginal philosophies. The most famous of these Indonesian seafarers are the Macassans. In the 1700s, Chinese demand for trepang, or sea cucumber, exploded, and Cantonese businessmen began searching for reliable producers. They found them in Makassar, modern-day Sulawesi, and soon fleets of Macassan praus, or ships, were sailing south every year on the monsoonal winds. They called Northern Australia Marajay, or the wild country, and they searched for trepang in its warm tidal waters. They camped with Aboriginal mob, and their visits had a significant influence on the language, culture and genetics of saltwater people. For instance, the Yolngu of East Arnhem Land call money rupiah, as do Indonesians. Macassan trepanging continued until their industry was effectively taxed to death by Australian authorities in 1900. There are other examples of this intercultural communication between Indonesia and Northern Australia. For instance, the first white stockmen to push cattle into the Victoria River country about 1800 encountered Aboriginal men with Van Dyke beards. They had copied this style from Makassar Trapangas, who had copied it themselves from the Dutch colonial rulers of Indonesia. From its isolated embryonic settlements in southern Australia, the British Empire sent its explorers north to ascertain its equitable worth for farming and mining. These white Argonauts ventured into the outback with their horses and their Aboriginal guides or trackers. They expected to find an enormous inland sea, mythological creatures and even the pyramids of lost civilizations. But instead they encountered mysterious groups of Aboriginal people living traditional way in the bush. Like Tim Flannery, what I find fascinating about these initial outback interactions between white and black is that they represent a linking up of the great gulf of human movement out of Africa. Europeans and Aborigines had been genetically separated for over 60,000 years, and yet they could communicate and even procreate. This is a true testament to the million-year development of humanity on the African savannah. It is interesting that colonial expansion into northern Australia involved the same vast spaces and grandiose opportunities that were spiritually and ideologically present in America's western expansion. Small teams of special stockmen called drovers pushed huge mobs of cattle thousands of kilometres into the never-never regions of northern Australia. Like Argonauts, these drovers crossed immense distances and spent upwards of 18 hours a day in the saddle. They lived simply off bread called damper and beef, so they often experienced scurvy known as Barcoo rot. They also contracted chronic eye infections or sandy blight from the perpetual outback dust. These drovers performed some of the greatest feats of human endurance in history, but they also pushed thousands of head of cattle over thousands of kilometres of Aboriginal land. This inevitably desecrated sacred sites, destroyed critically important water holes, and on occasion they fought with and killed Aboriginal people. Eventually they reached their destination and began developing outback cattle stations. This often caused some degree of guerrilla warfare with local Aboriginal groups. Today, people travel from all over the world to northern Australia to meet Aboriginal people and learn about their culture. But in the frontier days, many white cattlemen regarded them as just another strange pest, like saltwater crocodiles or king brown snakes, and treated them as such. Consequently, Aboriginal people in northern Australia experienced brutal frontier violence. I recommend reading Frontier Justice by Tony Roberts. It is a very well researched book. It focuses on pastoral expansion into the Gulf country around Borroloola and the Roper River before 1900. And so it eventually came to pass that the filibustering white cattlemen on horseback and armed with rifles took control of the plains. They learnt early that they could not run cattle on country where Aboriginal people were living traditionally. So the remnants of these tribes were pushed out into the rough periphery of their lands. Eventually though, through threat, negotiation or necessity, they moved back into the stations and became a de facto labour pool for the cattlemen. The mob would usually live in a creek bed near the homestead and work for rations. This system endured across northern Australia well into the second half of the 20th century. At best, it was an unfair employment arrangement, and at worst, it was chattel slavery. However, the stations would shut down for the annual wet season, and this allowed Aboriginal cultural practices to continue and thus be alive today. During the Second World War, Northern Australia became the Allied front line against Japanese expansion. From 1942 until 1943, a fierce air and naval war raged across the top end. The military took control of civilian areas and thousands were evacuated down south. Aboriginal people were brought in from the bush and enlisted to build runways and support long-range reconnaissance missions. We were attacked over 100 times. Places were bombed, ships were sunk, planes were shot out of the sky, and many people were killed. The Second World War showed that Northern Australia was critical to our national security. Since then, grand ideas for developing the North have attracted a long line of expensive and ill-fated projects that continue optimistically to this day. It is important to remember that Northern Australia has a dark history. To make way for the herds of cattle in some regions, ambush was used to secretly clear Aboriginal people off their country. It was supported by native police on the ground, sanctioned by white officers, and facilitated cryptically by some colonial administrators as dispersals. What followed was massive land theft and paternalistic government policies that controlled the lives of tens of thousands of Aboriginal peoples through much of the 20th century. But colonisation was strangely not really completed here, and its first peoples have survived into a modern era of changing perceptions of their importance to what Australia really is. Today, Northern Australia is considered the poorest part of the country. Much of it is still remote and difficult to access, but this has allowed some of its ecosystems to remain pristine, and some Indigenous languages are still spoken up here, and in some parts of the bush the old ways are still followed. The north's a frontier, and so Australia's cultural characteristics are exaggerated up here. It's always beer drinking weather and the fishing's great. Thanks for watching. If you're interested, then please hit the like and subscribe buttons. For the next episode, I'm going to discuss the Federation of Australia into a new and continental nation in 1901. Cheers.